Alright, starting off this cutting board, I had some walnut and maple turning blanks that were approximately 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches and 12 inches long. I just ran them along my table saw blade to make sure they were nice and square and 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches completely. Whenever you buy turning stock, they will come in mostly square. If you get 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, it could be 1.75 inches, 1 inch and 5/8. It's never exact. So whenever I got all this stuff, I just ran it through my table saw, make sure it was exactly the size I wanted it to be. The process took a little while, but it's worth it to make sure the pieces are exactly the same size. Now, the first step is once you get your stock cut to width, you just glue strips together in alternating colors. In this case, again, it's maple and walnut. Eventually, this will be a checkerboard pattern. You can see I don't have clamps long enough to clamp panels together like this. So I took a small piece of plywood, drilled a bunch of holes in it, and you can see I'm using just dowels with some pieces of wood off-center drilled just to sort of clamp everything together. Now once you got your panels clamped together and the glue dries, you just cut strips out of the panels perpendicular to the pattern. And each strip is approximately 1.25 inches, I believe. Might have been 1.5 inches. I think it's 1.25 inches. Whatever width you make these strips, this will be the thickness of your end grain cutting board. And once I got all of those strips cut, I went to my poor man's jointer, which is literally just an electric planer that I clamped into my bench vise. And I just flattened out both sides. The sides I'm flattening out are the long grain sides that happen to have glue on them. And I'm just taking very slight passes. It's whatever the lowest setting this planer will do. And I just do maybe 1-2 passes on each side, and it gets rid of all the glue. And again, it's a process that takes a little bit of time, depending on how many strips you have and how big your board's going to be. Also, the blades in this planer are nearly brand new, so they leave a really smooth finish. Alright, and the second glue up is gluing all of those strips together. And you'll notice I took each strip and flipped it counter to the previous strip. So once I get the glue on and then put all the long grain sides together, it turns into a nice little checkerboard pattern. As far as how much glue to use, I honestly have no idea. My philosophy when gluing things together is if I feel like I'm using enough glue, I'm probably not using enough glue. And again, I'm just using my little clamping rig. It doesn't clamp with a tremendous amount of pressure, but it works well enough for what I needed it to do. Alright, I do not have a thickness sander or a planer, which honestly using a planer for an end grain cutting board I've been told is kind of dangerous to do, but instead I opted to spend $0, use some scrap plywood, and I built myself a planing sled for my router. Now this process took me about 2 hours because I only had a 1/2 inch straight bit in my router. It was the largest bit I had. Basically, the larger the router bit, the quicker this process will be. And I also only have a palm router, so that limits the size of the router bits I can get because I only have a 1/4 inch shank. Essentially, all it is 2 rails that are identical in height that a sled rides across. So then you plane it at exactly the same height all the way across. And here I'm just sanding it to get it flat. Once I do this, I will flip it over and do the other side in the exact same manner. I did not record it, however. Alright, and here I'm doing something that is dangerous and should never be attempted by anyone watching this video ever. The table saw I have has a very small table, so I had a difficult time trying to get this thing cut, and I was using a miter gauge, and I wasn't really thinking, so I just raised the blade up through the wood, created a lot of smoke. Then I got smart and created a straight edge using a straight piece of wood and grabbed my cordless circular saw. This was significantly easier and also significantly safer. And then I just cut the same amount off of each side. I left about 1/2 inch or so as a border going around the edges. There's really, it's not a set in stone sort of thing. It's just whatever you think looks nice. I kind of like having a border like that. And here I just took a piece of scrap plywood and cut a little section out of it to use as a guide, so I could route out some handholds. This way, whenever the board's sitting on a flat surface, you can get your fingers in under it and lift it up. And then I just went to the other side. I did my best to get them symmetrical, equidistant from both sides, but I think they were a little off. And the key here, I went full depth with my routing, but the key is to really take light cuts. So that's why it took me a little while. Once that was done, I went ahead and sanded the cutting board, which I didn't record. Then I used a damp rag to wipe it down to raise the grain. Then I resanded it up to 220, I believe. And then for the finish, I'm just using some mineral oil. The key to the mineral oil is you want to get it completely saturated, let it soak completely through the cutting board. So you'll see I put on a lot, flipped it over, and then put a lot on the other side as well. And it will take some time before the oil stops seeping out, but it will protect it. And here's some time-lapse footage of the oil sinking into the wood. It really takes a lot.